So, you're ready to research government policies and provide solutions to big problems through an OA speech. Now what do? You gotta start researching potential topics. And here are the best tips I've found for developing a strong OA topic. I found year after year, I end up giving almost the same feedback to students, so I've tried to synthesize the core comments that I give. Many of these tips actually end up overlapping a little bit, but hopefully you'll see that each of them have some distinct points that I'm trying to make. The first one, make sure your harms, i.e. the problems that you outline, have serious consequences with society. So this is about severity. Sometimes I see original advocacy topics that outline problems that, might be issues, but really aren't that serious. It's not devastating lives. It's not impacting people's abilities to lead meaningful and happy existences. Here are some examples of bad OA topics. One I got a couple of years ago was about internet companies having unfair monopolies. Yeah, it's really annoying. You go and try to get your internet provider and you only have one option and they get to set the prices. Darn, that's really annoying that they're able to set prices high. Now, what's the problem with this topic? Well, me having to pay $15 more a month is annoying, and I guess it hurts my pocketbook a little bit, and it might affect people who can't easily afford such things, but ultimately it doesn't have serious impacts on society. It's more of an annoyance at best, or at worst, but nothing too serious. Another example of a bad OA topic that I've seen many times is about tech companies having planned obsolescence. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's the idea that they actually program your phone to stop working or to work very poorly after a couple of years so that you have to buy a new version. Again, that's really annoying that tech companies are doing that. And maybe there's a world in which you could articulate some serious impacts, but in and of itself, I think it's hard to prove that planned obsolescence is seriously ruining lives across society and causing big, dramatic harms. So those are some examples of bad OA topics. Ideally, right, the types of severity that we're talking about here are lives being lost or severe economic costs or lives being ruined, even if they're not even if people don't die, if the lives are ruined in some way through injury or depression, etc., those can be serious harms. Or perhaps you can get a little more abstract in terms of egregious violations of human liberty or of our basic rights. Those are the types of problems that OAs talk about. But as my director, when I was a student in speech and debate, used to say, the biggest harms in an original advocacy speech are dead bodies and dollars. So the second point I have is about unexpected, making sure your topic isn't obvious. If you give a topic that's really obvious, something like climate change, your audience will feel a little bit bored because they'll already feel like they already know a lot about the topic and they already probably have some set opinions about it. The best topics surprise your audience. They are unexpected. They're things that people didn't even realize were big problems. And oftentimes, the state champions in original advocacy have topics that people had no idea were issues. So in general, if the issues you're thinking about writing a speech on are issues that politicians are always talking about and bringing up, then it's probably too cliche. Let's look at some good examples of speeches. So some good ones, right? A couple of years ago, we had a speaker give a speech on 911 call centers. That's the call center that reaches or responds to your call when you call 911 with an emergency. Now, we think of 911 as being this magic wand, right? You call 911, give them your emergency, and all of a sudden they will figure out where you are and send responders immediately. The reality that this speech showed is that our 911 call centers are actually horribly underfunded, horribly understaffed, and have horribly outdated technology. So when you call 911 call centers, you cannot at all depend on them actually showing up in a timely manner at all. And it's actually leading to a lot of problems. So that's one example of a speech that wasn't really obvious. Most people just presume that 911 call centers work. Another good example, the state championship speech, or the state champion of this past year, wrote a speech on sunscreen, right? We all think that sunscreen is good. And like I said in the last video, this speech showed that sunscreen actually is causing a lot of problems, whether it's health issues, especially in women in terms of reproductive health, or whether it's the health of our environment, specifically coral reefs being decimated, which jeopardizes a lot of ecosystems and humanity itself. That's an interesting speech, right? Because people don't think intuitively that sunscreen is bad. Another example was a speech on the lottery, which also made it to the final round of state. And this speech showed that the lottery, which most of us think is a relatively harmless way for us to reach for the stars and keep those dreams alive of one day becoming rich, actually preys on the most vulnerable in society, the poor. And so this speech on the lottery was able to show that this thing that we don't think a lot about, the lottery, is actually really ruining a lot of lives and isn't putting dollars where they're supposed to go. So those are all good examples of topics, right? These are speeches that are unexpected, that surprise the audience. You wouldn't think that these are causing problems, but they are. Some bad examples, right? Speeches that aren't unexpected, that don't surprise the audience in any ways, are things like climate change or gun control or healthcare. I'm not saying that those aren't serious issues. Of course, those are serious issues. And of course, you could argue that they have big consequences on society. The issue with those topics, though, is they're not going to feel original. They're going to feel a little bit more boring because an audience already feels they know something about it, and they're much more likely then to just start tuning you out, right? Why would they pay attention to a 10-minute speech if they think they already know everything that you're about to talk about? My third piece of advice: find common ground. You need to create common ground between you and your audience. Another way to think about this phrase common ground, I know it's a little bit weird, is to think about establishing a speech topic that is relevant to your audience. And so the easiest way to establish relevancy is to show that the audience that the harms of your topic affect or could potentially affect the audience directly. Now, not every speech could potentially affect the audience in the room, and there are examples of successful OAs. And if it doesn't affect the audience directly, then you need to show that the harms are so egregious that they can move an audience to care about a problem that doesn't affect them. I know that's a little bit abstract, so let's get more concrete. Here are some good examples, in my opinion, of original advocacies that are relevant to an audience, that affect an audience. One example of a state champion from Bellarmine was about 5 years ago. It was a speech on tap water. Now, most of us think we can turn on the water in our sink, drink a glass of it, and we are totally good to go. Now, this speech came out before everything that happened in Flint, Michigan, and it showed that actually a lot of tap water across America is really dangerous, even here in California. It has dangerous chemicals in it, dangerous elements that are not well regulated by the government and can lead to high rates of cancer. Now, that's scary, right? That affects everybody in the room. Everybody thinks that they can just drink tap water. Probably everyone has been drinking tap water. To show the audience, holy cow, this topic affects you, that's powerful, and that will keep an audience really engaged. Another example of a state champion from Bellarmine in 2011, so a while back, was about tort law. Tort law is the law that you would use if, for instance, you bought a nice hot coffee from McDonald's, spilled it on yourself, and decided you wanted to sue McDonald's for millions of dollars. It's personal injury law. And so we think of tort law as probably being a good check on abuses in American society, but weirdly enough, American society is the only society that has such strong personal injury laws. And this speaker showed that tort law is actually dramatically raising healthcare costs. One of the reasons that American healthcare is so much more dramatically expensive than every other country in the world is because of the fears that doctors and hospitals have about being sued due to tort law. So instead of making healthcare cheap, they very much jack up the prices and do a lot of unnecessary things to make sure so that they cannot be sued. So again, that's a speech that affects everybody. Everybody has to get healthcare at some point or another, and everybody is affected by high healthcare costs. Not only is everybody affected by that when they have to go to the doctor, it also has adverse economic impacts on the U.S. economy as a whole. So this was a very compelling speech because it showed that something we don't think a lot about, tort law, is having unintended consequences somewhere else with healthcare. So those are examples of speeches, water and tort law, that are affecting everybody in the room and therefore become very compelling or interesting to an audience, right? It's much more interesting to hear about a problem that affects you than something that is affecting some abstract group of people. So here are some examples of speeches that I think aren't as successful. And I'm not saying there's no world where these speeches could be successful. There are certainly speeches like this that have been successful in the past. For instance, I saw a speech make it to the finals of state about human trafficking, right? Very few people in the audience have been victims of human trafficking, I hope. But nevertheless, right, a speech like that can certainly garner a lot of sympathy. But nevertheless, speeches like that tackle topics like veteran health care or homelessness might not be as engaging to an audience. And I know that sounds callous, but when one speech in a room is talking about how the tap water that everybody drinks might be giving them cancer, and you're talking about a problem that doesn't affect everybody in the room, you're just fighting a much harder uphill battle to keep your audience engaged and to make yourself stand out as a speaker. So I really strongly urge you to try to find a topic that is relevant to everybody, that could affect everybody in the room. And I guess one other point to make under this subpoint is to make sure you avoid topics that are overly political. Something like gun control would just be far too heated and politically charged. If you get someone judging you who doesn't agree with your opinion, for instance, if you're saying that we need better gun control in America, and you get somebody in the audience who doesn't believe that we should increase gun control in America, you could automatically get marked down much more than your speech deserves. So I think that's why it's much safer to choose topics that aren't political, that have common ground regardless of one's political affiliation, right? No one, regardless of their political affiliation, is going to be offended that you're talking about tap water, right? But something like gun control or climate change or healthcare absolutely could be more politically charged. And my final piece of advice, something that I see a lot, is to make sure that the problem you outline is actually within the scope of the United States federal government or state's government to solve it. It needs to be solvable. So sometimes, right, speakers choose problems that meet all of the criteria I talked about above, but just don't have good solutions. They're just too vast and too serious to end up being solved. So your solution needs to be something fairly straightforward and intuitive. Why? Because you have a 10-minute speech. Trying to solve something like poverty will not be possible in a 10-minute speech. It's just far too complex of a problem, and it's far too big and broad. However, you probably could present the harms of something like the lottery and propose a simple solution to ban it. That makes a lot more intuitive sense. Or if you're talking about tap water, providing a simple solution of increasing Environmental Protection Agency regulations of tap water, that's pretty straightforward, right? Those are the types of things that you want in a speech. A problem that is more narrow and thus more easily solvable within a 10-minute speech. The other thing you got to watch out for is just things that aren't really within the jurisdiction of the United States federal government or would require world or international action in order to solve. So a topic I see proposed year after year is about fish populations being depleted, especially in the South China Sea. Now that's definitely bad for environmental sustainability and has a huge range of serious environmental impacts that could affect humanity at large. The issue is that the United States alone couldn't really fix that problem. It would require international action with countries like China and South Korea and Japan and India. And just so many actors are involved within this problem that the United States alone wouldn't really be able to do anything to fix it. Second, right, problems that are just outside of the U.S., like developing countries not having good water standards, which leads to thousands of deaths every year, perhaps millions, that's a serious issue, absolutely. But it ultimately is not something that the United States could easily solve. Moreover, it's something that the audience will feel inherently more disconnected from than problems that pertain to American society. Just as people living in America, it makes sense. So those are my biggest pieces of advice. The good news about choosing an OA topic is it's more concrete than some of the other speech events. And so it's typically covered by many news sources. You don't have to dig too deep typically to find examples of OA topics, though certainly it's not the type of thing that you can just sit down and find in 10 minutes. So here are my recommendations for how to research an original advocacy topic. First, and probably most importantly, read the news. And not just short-form tabloid news, like what you see on your Facebook feed or Twitter, right? My recommendation is to read longer form journalism like the New York Times or The Economist or The Atlantic, and make it a daily habit to read the news at some point during the day, whether that's at breakfast or on your way to school or before bed. You don't find a topic by just sitting down, typing up a magic phrase on Google, and finding it within 10 minutes. It requires you to be ever vigilant and always keeping your eyes open to try to find what might be a good topic. Second, watch late night talk show hosts, especially John Oliver. Obviously, you're not giving daily political updates. Those points of the talk show probably aren't going to be that relevant, but oftentimes these hosts tackle bigger issues in longer segments, right? John Oliver almost always has a long segment at the end of his show that's not talking about the daily news, but instead tackling a bigger issue. And that helps you to stay informed about big problems in American society. A great example, John Oliver did a segment on pharmaceutical drug companies. And in this segment, he talked about the ways in which pharmaceutical drug companies are paying doctors to push their products onto patients. Now, wait a second. That seems a little bit corrupt, right? We think of our doctors as trusted individuals who will give us expert medical advice on what we need. If we think about doctors as people who are accepting money to just push drugs onto us, the patient, that seems like a corrupt system. And so that gave the impetus to a speech last year that ended up getting third place at the state championship tournament on the opioid epidemic. This speech looked at the way in which pharmaceutical drug companies were pushing products onto doctors and the government. So that's one example, right? By watching John Oliver, you would have found this longer form segment, which would have helped you to pinpoint some serious issues. Another good way to find an OA topic is to watch documentaries about societal problems. My favorite is an HBO documentary series, Vice News. Oftentimes, right, they're talking about issues that wouldn't be good for OAs. They're either international or they're talking about culture, but sometimes they do tackle issues that very much could be transformed into good OA topics. Likewise, I'm sure you could find lots of other documentaries about current problems with things going on in American society. And I guess my last piece of advice is to find a topic that ultimately interests you. If you are bored by your topic and you don't feel much of a connection to it, you will never write a good speech, right? You chose original advocacy, hopefully, because you like the prospect of researching policies and concrete problems within society and finding concrete solutions to fix those problems. So hopefully that passion should carry forward into finding a speech that you likewise feel passionate about. So try to find a problem that you think you could research and stick with for a long period of time and continue to be motivated by and passionate about. That will really help. If you get bored by your speech easily, then I promise you, you will write a boring speech. So hopefully this has helped in terms of developing some basics of how to find a good OA topic and things to watch out for. Again, really review those 4 points I made about the criteria for a good topic, because year after year, these are the comments I give students. So hopefully I don't have to be redundant, and instead I can just give you some more productive comments when you present some of your topic proposals. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. Cheers.